but just want to share quickly. In this, as a reminder about some of what we do and why. And one of our things this year is to encourage people to be the one to remember that you are good. And we strongly believe that. But we each need to work to spread that good, to make the world a better place because of who we are, the things we do. And so we believe that with the law impacts a lot of people. There's a lot of concerns and issues. And we believe you're capable of understanding it, especially pieces and how they connect as you work to do that, as we talk about it, as we discuss issues. Because no one can understand everything in the law without hearing opposing viewpoints, without understanding the sides, why the law is doing what it is. There's usually an impetus or a reason for that. And so as a reminder, we just ask that you do follow basic rules of respect and civility. These are serious issues that the law is trying to address. And I think it's a constant work in motion. We're trying to figure out what the appropriate balance is. And we encourage you to listen to learn and not to attack or go after others that way. So starting out, we have a request to talk about SB 132 that came in. So wanted to bring that up. That is driving privilege card fingerprinting requirements. Sorry, too many screens here. Let me share that quickly. All right, so this bill is allowing a private fingerprint vendor to request approval to take digital fingerprint scans of an applicant for purposes of a driving privilege card application. And I think if I understood correctly, there were concerns about the government taking biometric data from individuals and whether that was legal, constitutional, appropriate, a couple different things. So I think it's helpful to potentially to look at what a driving privilege card is. Driving privilege cards are given in Utah to people who do not have proof of US citizenship or documents to show that they're here legally. And so Utah made the decision that if people are here and they haven't been picked up by the federal government and they're not committing a crime, we should give them the ability to drive with a driving privilege card. And so Utah requirements prior to this bill have required anyone that wants a driving privilege card to submit to a fingerprint and background check. And what this bill is doing is it's proposing to let private vendors who take digital fingerprint scans to do that fingerprint processing and submit those to the driver's license division when these people are trying to get a driving privilege card. They can also submit the scans, I guess, to the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, BCI in Utah. And so, again, I think the concern was that was being asked about, is it appropriate for the government to be collecting biometric data without a warrant and probable cause? And in general, the law is that if the government wants to do something, it needs a warrant and probable cause. If they're going to come in and inspect my home, for example, or if they want to search my computer or do different things like that, then they need that warrant and probable cause. But one of the issues that we run into, and this is something we've talked about in previous legislative reviews, but it's an ongoing issue, is that the government starts to do things that aren't required. And so the federal government, the example is they give money to states for education. They don't have to do that. There's not a constitutional mandate that the federal government has to fund education in the states. But they make the decision to give money there. And when they do, it creates the opportunity for the federal government to say, hey, if you want our money, then you have to do X, Y, and Z. And through that, the government starts to buy different freedoms and can control different things because there's no mandate, there's no law that you have to take the funds. And when there's no mandate that you have to take the funds, it's considered a privilege or something that you don't have to do. And so the courts have let the governments circumvent the Constitution quite a bit with things like that. So we have a driving privilege card, which is a privilege given to undocumented individuals. And what the state's saying is, hey, if you want this privilege, you don't have to have the privilege, you don't have to drive. But if you want it, then you need to submit to a background check and a fingerprint requirement. And so I'm curious to hear if any of you have thoughts about within that limited realm. Obviously, there's a discussion about where that could lead. But for the moment, do you have thoughts in that limited realm of if we're going to let undocumented individuals get a driving privilege card, should we be fingerprinting and background checking them? Or should we not be and just letting anyone get a driving privilege card? I'm just interested if you have strong feelings either way on that.
Hi, Austin. This is Janet.
Hey, Janet.
Given the circumstance, in other words, the definition of the people who this is addressing, it seems to me if you're illegal in a country and if you're taking any money from the government, then yeah, I think it should be allowed. It can be a slippery slope because from here it could go to all of us, So that's the only concern I have. But I just think that's a minimum requirement to have to identify yourself so that, we know that there are certain statistics that are kept. So surely they're looking at that, whether there's higher crime in that population and so on. And so they want to have them documented in that event.
Okay, so you see potential for there to be some documentation that exists with this, which is, I think, true, that it's a way to start to get documentation in place. And to your point, could it be spread elsewhere? It potentially could. But one of the interesting things is, if we're talking about the Constitution at least, does the Constitution apply differently whether you're here illegally or legally? And for the most part, the Supreme Court has held that if you're here in the United States, the Constitution applies to you. And that's been one where they've pushed the boundaries of that. The government has with things like Guantanamo Bay, where they build prisons off of American soil and they imprison non-American citizens. And the Supreme Court hasn't extended the Constitution to protect prisoners sitting in American prisons on foreign soil that were arrested by Americans. And so we have prisoners that, much like the founders predicted, have sat in jail for 20 years with no trial, no bail, no charges, and they're just sitting there rotting because they're not on American soil. But we do have these people now that are on American soil. Some people, like Janet, like you pointed out, say, well, we need to have some documentation. We've got to have some ability to check into things. And I think that Utah agrees with you, which is why they have this requirement with the driving privilege cards. And so, certainly I think an important consideration to bring up. But is there anyone here that feels differently or has any other opinions on those cards or concerned about requiring fingerprinting with those? And if not, that's totally fine. But it's a chance if you want. You can comment in chat as well if you'd like. But that is one where the fingerprinting technology is becoming very advanced. You used to go in and roll ink on your fingers and things, and then they had a kind of dry powder thing they used, and now you just put it on a scanner, and they can scan the scanners pick up your fingerprints very well, and you submit those. And for example, California came out with a fingerprinting requirement for all attorneys. They got concerned that their attorneys were becoming bad people. And they required that all attorneys that wanted to renew their California bar license, we have to renew it each year, get fingerprinted and submit our fingerprints. So I'm licensed in California and licensed in Utah as an attorney, which meant that in order to keep my California license, I had to send my fingerprints into the state of California. And things like that start to get very questionable. But California would say we're not conducting a search and seizure under the Constitution because it's a privilege. And you don't have to be an attorney if you don't want to be. So go be something else if you're concerned about being fingerprinted. But technically, we talk about the driving privilege card, but technically our driver's licenses are privileges as well. We don't have to drive. I don't think that the courts would recognize it as we have this inherent right to drive and operate a deadly vehicle. And so could they apply the same legal type precedent to that situation? They possibly could. And that, again, to Janet's points, creates a potential slippery slope. So, but that's one to look at. Another one to look at, Don, I know you had commented on some of these that might be of interest to you, is the Amber Alert bill, HB 266. And that one, let's see if I pull it up here. HB 266 specifically authorizes the government to use some biometric data. It does a couple things. Sorry, I guess not quite biometric. We're getting a little bit closer to biometric, but in this bill, they're trying to limit the number of Amber Alerts issued because we had a string of Amber Alerts that were custody dispute type Amber Alerts. And there were a lot of people. There was one particular that the Amber Alert went out at 2 or 3 in the morning, I think, woke up a lot of people, their phones beeping really loud. And it was a mother or something that didn't want to give the child to the father and had taken off with it. And people were pretty upset, going, hey, look, if you're going to wake us up, if you're going to send out an emergency, make sure it's a real emergency. We looking at Amber Alerts as non-family type abductions. And so I think the most recent Amber Alert we got specifically said non-family abduction on it. But this lawmaker is saying, hey, we should potentially make sure that there's an actual credible threat of imminent danger to the child and not just mother's taking the child because she doesn't want to give him to dad. But it does go through in this bill. One other thing it authorizes is if an Amber Alert's issued, they can use relevant law enforcement technology, including an automatic license plate reader system, to locate a vehicle that is being sought. And so relevant law enforcement technology could include things like face scanners, could include fingerprints from any of these things, could include, whatever's in their possession, essentially. And it's technically to locate a vehicle, which most likely they would say constitutionally we don't have much of an expectation of privacy in because we register those with the government each year. But this is specifically authorizing Utah to use automatic license plate readers when an Amber Alert's issued. So it's doing two things. It's restricting the use of them, but expanding the law enforcement permissions associated with enforcement when that happens. And I know for some people, this will produce a Fourth Amendment concern that they're being searched. Technically, if there's an Amber Alert issued and they have a car and a suspect, in theory, a judge would probably issue a warrant to search or seize that person. I think that a judge wouldn't ask for a lot of proof on that to issue a warrant if a child's life were considered in danger. But this doesn't say they have to go to the judge first. It says they can just take that step. So curious if any of you have any concerns or thoughts in conjunction with that, with privacy or data the government's collecting.
Austin, this is Janet again.
Yeah.
Just, your final comments in the previous case and also here. It definitely is a concern when the government starts doing this, because it so easily can be applied to everyone or another segment and then another and then another in the population. Are you saying that they would turn on license readers so that anyone going through traffic is being captured, or are we already being captured?
To my knowledge, we're already using license plate readers, but not for criminal purposes in general, unless, there's some kind of warrant or something issued. But to my knowledge, there's quite a few in place.
Yeah, because I was thinking they were already doing it possibly.
Yeah, but this is giving a specific authorization for a law enforcement purpose to say, we're going to authorize you to use these to bring criminal justice against somebody. Because the government has quite a bit it does. If you look at the NSA, for example, there's quite a bit that's going on with them looking at things, but the NSA currently, the data they collect isn't being used to bring criminal charges against us. They're collecting it for other purposes. And so the government has a lot of things where they collect information, but they don't use them for criminal purposes because the Supreme Court has mostly held the Fourth Amendment to protect us from criminal charges that violate the search and seizure probable cause requirements of the Fourth Amendment.
And of course, someday we could be criminals if we don't have a vaccine.
These are things that to some people they would say absolutely that's on the horizon. Other people would say no, but whether it's a vaccine, whether it's taxes, for example, I would submit that with how complicated the tax code is, I venture to bet that virtually every American has violated the tax code somehow. And when the laws get to be so burdensome, there's so many of them, and we have hundreds of new laws passed every year. It's very difficult to keep up. Very difficult to keep up. And yes, could we be criminals? Normal citizens one day and criminals another, whether it's cell phones. Even, we're going to look today at some bills to ban, that are proposing to ban teenagers from accessing social media. And so if you're an executive in a company and you don't do things quite well enough, there's, starting out, it's civil penalties, but generally those evolve into criminal penalties later. I know in the food industry, if you're an executive of a food company, and I had a professor in law school that bragged about this. He was a prosecutor. He put 5 executives of a food company in jail because some bugs had gotten into some of the food that they were making. And the company had even gone through, they had done all their inspections, they'd done all their checks that were required. They even had certifications given to show how clean their facility was and things, but some bugs still got in. And under federal law, you can be criminally liable for bugs in food, even if you did everything you were supposed to try and stop it. So he was really proud he'd put him in jail, 5 executives. And again, these are things that when our laws get so far reaching, and things. They start to impact each of us. They start to have things that apply to each of us. And even on that type, side of things, we have some bills this session. There's 2 of them that I know of. There may be more, but they're trying to mandate child abuse reporting for everybody, which in Utah, it's already kind of there. We're all supposed to report child abuse, but there are a few exceptions, notably with bishops, priests, in the religious realm. But if a bishop has a father come in and says, hey, 10 years ago, I did something to a child I shouldn't have, I want to repent, and the bishop makes the call to not report it, and then the father abuses the kid again, now is that bishop potentially a criminal because of these mandatory laws, or that priest or somebody else? And so, yes, I think it's very wise for us to say, even if we believe we're a good person, under the weight of the laws that exist, are we all going to walk appropriately? Are we all going to not be a criminal at some point? And if the state has access to check a lot of things, how stressful does life become? If the state can know that a child walked by me that had a bruised eye, and I didn't stop and call the police because the child had a bruised eye, could I be criminally liable for that? Could I be in trouble for that? And then if a child has a bruised eye, then everyone's calling the police as the kid walks by. What does that do to parents? What does it do to society? We start to have some of these interesting questions come in. And the founders, I think, understood that. They knew the weight of being one day a normal citizen, the next day being an outlaw, because that happened often in England, where when you oppose the king, he could pass a law that would make you a criminal. And so they put these protections in place. But they're ones that we know we're facing things about safety, we're facing things about predators, we're facing things about kidnappers, serious things. We're trying to find ways to address that, but are these the appropriate means or not? It's tough to tell. So let me know if you have any more thoughts on those bills in particular.
One of the things I think of when you're talking about that is today, from everything I gather from my research, there's a propensity for the child services. I forget what they call it, but where they take the children away from the parents.
Yeah,
yeah, there's a lot of horror stories about that where it was really unjustified, and that's where that slippery slope is. It can just get so out of whack, and the parents really have no power except through the judicial system, which can take forever.
Yeah, can often take quite a while. So you're talking about DCFS. And yes, we have this strong inclination to protect children, understandably. But it does give a very strong position to the government to be able to follow up on an allegation or make an allegation. And then the parents are left defending to try and get their kids back. And I personally know people that have been through that. Personally know a family that had a child in foster care that they were about to adopt. And someone made the allegation against them that they had sexually done something to the child. And from at least my perspective, what I believe about the people and what they share, it was a false accusation. The child was taken away, placed with another family. They fought and fought and fought in courts, but eventually lost access to that child. The courts were, I think, more inclined to err on the side of protection, let it go with another family. And this kid that was supposed to be with this family and be adopted by them lost that family. And the family lost that child that they had worked for a long time to be able to adopt. And so, yes, we have these things where it's important, I think, whenever we look at, do we want to, when we try and protect, when we try and do things, are we doing it in a way that creates checks and balances on the powers that exist? To me, one of the big things about government is to recognize that when the power's there, government will use it, and people will use it, and that's understandable. But it can start to be abused, and it can start to affect all of us when it's abused. And the founders, I think, were wise enough because they lived through a lot of those abuses. They saw the king pass things where you're now a criminal if you had tea from the wrong company, or if you were not paying taxes on your stamps or documents or other things. And they saw this power that came by being able to criminalize activity and then just go in and pursue that. And so with that, when we're talking about checks and balances, I think it leads in well to HB 311, which is talking about banning teens from using social media. And to me, this is a very, very high stakes, you could almost say, type principle or topic to discuss, because there's a lot of things at stake, there's a lot to unpack with Utah's proposal to ban teenagers that are under 16 from accessing social media. So at the outset, if you're on a computer and the computer asks you, how old are you? How many kids do you think would quickly learn that they need to just say they're 16? Virtually all of them, most likely. And so the only way for a law like this to really have teeth, to say you can't let someone under 16 on your platform, the only way for that to have any teeth or any enforceability is to actually mandate that social media companies verify age through something other than what the person says. And so then when you have, okay, well, what does it take to verify age in a way that can actually keep kids off? It comes down to, well, upload your driver's license, passport, or birth certificate. And the Utah law that's proposed is saying that by January 1st, 2024, all social media companies with 10 million users or more have to have every user verify their age by uploading one of those 3 documents, or like a driving privilege card or something. But yeah, driver's license, passport, or birth certificate. And so we had some concerns emailed about government intrusion, government search and seizure, government checking things out without probable cause. And now we're in this place where we're saying we have evidence that social media hurts children, that they shouldn't be using it. So we want to stop them till they're 16. And even once they're 16 and 17, they still have to have parental consent to join. So social media platform can't let anyone on under 16. They can let a 16 or 17-year-old on if the parent also consents to that. And this to me is one where, again, we're looking at saying, oh, there's this intense harm coming to kids. They actually have quite a few stories now about just how crazy addicted kids are when they log on at 10 and start using social media. It just warps their whole brain and their whole development. Quite a bit takes place. And that then puts us in a place of saying, so what do we do about that? Does the law need to regulate that? And if so, is it appropriate for us to be uploading our driver's licenses, passports, or birth certificates to Facebook, Twitter, TikTok? Because essentially we'd then be giving our, it's funny because the government comes out and says, oh, we're really concerned about TikTok security because it's the Chinese government that has it all. And so we banned TikTok on Utah government devices. But hey, guess what? If you want to use TikTok, you're going to need to upload your passport or your driver's license or your birth certificate so the Chinese government can see that. Or Elon Musk, with Twitter. So whether you trust him, don't trust him. And so that was that was an interesting thing. And so this bill, again, I look at it and say, do we want our driver's licenses to be sitting in a repository that could be hacked? The more places it is, the more likely that it gets hacked. Is that what's necessary to protect children? Are there other options? Curious if you have any thoughts on that, any of you.
Well, I do again. It's Janet.
That's
again.
great. It's great to share.
I'm not even a parent, but I think so. The government is infringing more and more on parental rights. And that's what I don't like about that bill. It should be up to the parents, not the social media sites, not the government. But again, here you have the government basically dictating to the parents. I mean, I see that parents can give consent at a certain age, but I don't like that aspect of it. That's what would bother me.
It's just taking away that ability for the parents to make the decision.
Yeah, because this is a one by one, step by step thing that the government's taking more and more control of children and in education and everywhere else. So I really don't like it for that reason.
Okay. Do you think it'd possibly help any kids that are in homes where parents don't care and they're just addicts by the age of 10?
Not really, because, I hear about the suicide rate being so high among young people their age. And if they can't get on and others are on and they're not, I mean, mentally, I think that's going to really mess around with those kids.
Okay. Yeah, if we're going to cut the kids off from what they're used to and what they've been doing, is that going to create more issues? Yeah, I think
And
that's
what their friends are doing. What their friends are doing.
Yeah.
I want to just mention one thing. I myself ran into this. I put a comment on Nextdoor that was about chemtrails. And I mentioned that the US Air Force is the one doing that. And the next day on my LinkedIn profile, a US Air Force military officer had looked at my profile. And the next day I was off LinkedIn. And LinkedIn sent me a message. It's been taken down. This is unrelated to Nextdoor. I mean, as far as I know, Microsoft doesn't own both of them. Just LinkedIn. And they said, if you want to submit your driver's license or passport, we might reconsider. And unfortunately, I'm not going to do that. So I don't have a LinkedIn profile now. Just thought I'd mention that because it's interesting how these companies work, even without the government. But it was the government that told them to do that.
Yeah, and it certainly seems that way with how those things go. And there are quite a few interesting stories to follow through of different things that have happened to people, accounts shut down. I personally have had an account shut down by PayPal. And it's very interesting to see what events immediately preceded it and takes place. And to your point, is it only the government to worry about? Do we have private companies to worry about? There's a lot of things to look at with, again, do we want Facebook to have all our personal data? Do we not? We give a lot of it to them anyways, voluntarily. I mean, most of us gave Facebook an accurate birth date, even though we weren't required to. And does this really change anything? Does it really protect us? Does it not? It'll be yet to be seen, I think, on what it actually does. But overall, I think it starts to develop the notion that one of the high concerns I have is that we're making it a company's responsibility to protect children. When that's a parental responsibility. And if we start giving that right or that responsibility to companies, then rights always follow responsibilities. And if someone starts being delegated all the responsibilities, and it's not our responsibility anymore. We lose rights, they gain rights,
Yeah.
because that's where the responsibility goes.
Yeah,
Um,
I was going to say that too, that it's not fair to the companies, actually, just from a business point of view, to make them police all these things. I don't think that's fair.
Yeah, I know that from my perspective, I've ventured into the app world, and we made a little app in Believe, and I look at it and go, wow, how in the world would I, if this applied to me right now, how would I even begin to comply with that? I wouldn't be able to. It only allows room for the big players. But yes, yep. Go ahead, Shirley.
Yes, Shirley. I just want to say I agree with Don. I don't think the businesses should be doing things like this. It's up to the parents. I think the parents need to have the full responsibility and keep the government out. I think this is just the beginning of opening doors for the government to do more and more. And I think if we don't rein them in now and let them know, no, we're responsible citizens, we will train up our children in the way that they should go, and you don't have any business. Because this just to me leads to another bill that tries to take away more parental right or require parents to do something. I mean, I'm a mother of 4, a grandmother of 7, and a great grandmother of 5.
That's awesome.
And my kids, keep track of what their kids are and aren't doing, even to the point where they limit how much time you can be on your, social media, because of the bad frequencies and what social media sites and everything. And I think if we left it up to the parents and just brought it to their attention, again, I just think it's a parental thing. It's not a government thing.
Okay. And one other thing that I think is often lost in this equation is the federal government was given the power to regulate what's called interstate commerce. And the theory was that there's no way for businesses to thrive if every state can have their own rules about what's required there, because it creates such a patchwork of laws that you can't move things through. And currently in America, we have sales tax that's imposed by states, cities, school districts, towns, counties, all kinds of things. And if you currently, the Supreme Court has now allowed for every local district to require that if you ship something to somebody within their district, that you have to collect and remit sales tax to that district. There are over, to my knowledge, there's over 14,000 taxing sales tax jurisdictions in the United States. So if you're a small business and you get an order from someone in Maine who likes your product and you ship it over, you're expected to collect sales tax at the Maine rate, remit a sales tax return to that jurisdiction in Maine, and track these 14,000 or so different rates, different rules, different requirements, and know where everybody lives. Now, there's no way to do that as a small business owner without hiring a company. There are some big companies that do that. There's obviously a fee involved. But the sheer load on a small company trying to get started means Amazon can do that. They have the money to pay people to comply with 14,000 sales tax returns, but a small company doesn't. And the founders knew things like that, and so they had Congress have the power over what they call interstate commerce, which is this commerce that flows between states, to set one rule, one regulation. But here in Utah, if we go and start setting rules for online companies to say, hey, you have to comply with this for people in Utah, and then Nevada says, hey, you have to do this for people in Nevada, and then we have 50 different requirements, there's no way for a small startup to break out of that if they have to comply with 50 different state laws and program for 50 different state laws. It's way too cost prohibitive, and it cements in the power or the place of big tech, the companies that have the money to pay to have 50 different intake processes designed, depending on the state you're in. And so that's another thing I look at with a bill like this is we often like to talk about states' rights and how helpful those are. But there are some areas where states' rights, where each state asserts their own thing, it can be very harmful to the economy, very harmful to a country, very harmful to business, and it can really stifle competition. And when states start regulating companies that are definitely around the nation, because you have to have 10 million user accounts, and Utah doesn't even have 10 million people in it. That's a clear sign that Utah is regulating interstate commerce, and that's a power that was given to Congress. And so it will be interesting. There may be some legal challenges, constitutional challenges to something like this. But I think it's something for us to look at from the big pictures to say, do we want our state doing this? Because if it's one rule, then it quickly turns to everyone programs it. It's very cheap and easy to get that programming, and startups can still happen. But when it's 50 rules, it becomes just cost prohibitive for a little company to ever make it out and become big. So just one of those points to think about with this. But turning to a couple of comments here. And so let's see. So this talks about, the comments talking says, when my husband's driver's license renewal came about in 2022, within his application online, he had to submit her consent to a breathalyzer test without question when pulled over, as well as renew his military draft, which he did 42 years ago before he could get an appointment at the DMV to renew. And then just feel we're being treated as a criminal before any crime has been committed. And so, you know, the selective service, the draft side, that is one that obviously has riled people for quite some time. But generally, the courts have consistently held, so far at least, that the federal government does have the power to mandate service through a draft. And that is one that obviously there's a lot of liberty concerns, but there's liberty concerns on both fronts of, you know, if we're not protecting our country, what does that look like if we are attacked and people don't want to fight? But we look back to things like Vietnam and say, but we were drafting to go fight wars in other countries. And why do we have the power to do that? And so I think on the draft side, we probably haven't struck an appropriate check and balance legally, because I don't know if the founders ever considered America going and jumping into wars in other countries like they have. And more, I think it was envisioned that would be for if America were attacked. But we have that side, certainly a concern on the military draft side. The breathalyzer test, I don't have knowledge of that personally, so I'd be really interested to look into that online consent to see what it's talking about. Because if Utah is requiring you to submit to a breathalyzer test if you're pulled over as a condition of getting a driver's license, then that would be an interesting, obviously search and seizure, Fourth Amendment type concern. But again, Utah would argue, well, you consented to it. You don't have to have a driver's license. So you chose to, and so it's kind of like they'd say, you chose to take the funding from the government with education so the government can regulate you. You chose to do this in exchange for a driver's license. Now, again, there's high concern with that, because could the government start to say, oh, we'd like to see your computer, your phone, we'd like fingerprints from you, all these things. If they're renewing a driver's license, there is that potential based on current precedent. And so we'd have to look at that. And then Shirley, you were asking, does the draft include females? Currently, the draft has only been required of males. And that is something that is being challenged in the courts. You know, like any good equality person would do, they'd say that's not equal. And so we have lawsuits, and I haven't seen how these have ended yet, so I need to look. But the arguments have been made. From what I know, the claims are pending with judges where they're saying, yeah, women should have to be drafted too. Women should have to sign up with selective service because we can fight, we can do things. And they have women in these lawsuits that are making these allegations. They have men in the lawsuits making the allegations. And so it'll be interesting to see how the courts go on that. My personal belief is yes, there are women that can fight. I have no doubt about that. But I believe that if we draft women to go to war, we will see intense mental health issues plague our society for a very long time. They already do with men. I personally feel that women and men have different strengths in general. And I have high concerns for a draft of the majority of women in the United States if we were to do that. But that is something that, again, the courts are weighing because the women have said we're the same. You can't coddle us. You can't treat us any differently. And the law, for the most part, has embraced that. So we'll see where selective service goes with females. Let's see. And then we had a question about HB 150. So this is a good one to talk about. Because it's always amazing to me what follows after we're so frustrated with something else. But HB 150 is, show you here, emergency water shortages. Talking about what we can do when there's an emergency water shortage. So we have a serious concern in Utah of, do we have enough water? We're a desert. Do we have enough water to go around? And that is something that the government's becoming quite concerned about, saying we're running out of water, Great Salt Lake's going down. You know, there are certainly some people that feel that people are intentionally doing things to try and get the water down. But no matter where we stand on it, Utah's saying that they're proposing to say that the governor may declare a temporary water shortage emergency by issuing an executive order. So the last place we had a lot of emergency executive orders was during COVID. And generally that produced an incredible amount of friction in our society. And the legislature got upset with the governor, and a lot of emergency orders, they had bills that clawed back some of that power from the governor. And now we're saying, oh yeah, suddenly if one day we wake up and there's not enough water, let's have the governor take control of things. They are putting in a few things here to say, oh, you know, the governor has to talk to the state engineer, talk to the Emergency Management Administration Committee. So they're creating a new committee. And so, you know, this is going to saying that they list the time period. They go through and talk about these things. They're going to go through and say that the governor can decide priorities of water use. You know, who has these and we're saying that even with, I guess they're saying a couple things. They're saying, for one, he can certainly make some recommendations about what to do or some orders about what to do. But they're also saying that if the governor issues an executive order declaring this emergency, that notwithstanding that, there's still use of water is preferred over other water use during the time period of the order. If the water is used in accordance with the executive order for one or more of the following purposes. So they're trying to say that even if the governor makes some emergency orders, you can still drink water. That's the highest priority. Second highest priority is sanitation. Third highest priority is fire suppression. And then fourth, animals come fourth. Generating electricity comes fifth. And then it goes down to, you know, military. I guess it's talking about generation of electricity by one of the following. So public water, military, agricultural, electric utility. And so they're trying to, I think, make some balances to this. They're trying to say, hey, let's have the ability to step in if there's an emergency, but also have some protections where you can at least drink water, you know, at a minimum. But one of the concerns I have about this happened with, not in water, but same type principle happened with Granite School District. I lived in Granite School District boundaries a little bit ago. and they had a massive property tax increase. And their rationale for it was they said, oh, well, we have all this infrastructure. It's really old, and all of it needs to be replaced to reach the 50-year mark or 60-year mark or whatever the year mark was. You know, some of the buildings were almost 100 years old, and they just said, huge emergency, we need to fix everything. And I looked at that and I said, why didn't you tell us this was coming? Why didn't you talk to us about this happening? Why didn't you start saving some money? Because you knew when you built these schools that they need to be replaced in 60 years. There'd been no saving of any money, no accounting for any of this that was necessary. It was just one day the school district says, alarms, we've got to replace everything. Huge property increase where you're going to bear the cost of these bonds that we have to take out for this overnight. And I look at that and say, was that proper use of, proper accountability to a government official? Because we had government officials that were tasked with keeping our schools up, tasked with overseeing schools, it's one of their jobs. And suddenly there's an emergency that says, we don't have enough money, we got to replace all the schools, huge tax increase. And I kind of feel like that's similar here, where water is something that we should probably be a little bit more wise about than just, guess what? We woke up today and there's not enough water. That's kind of a concern for me, that we're preparing for that type of state of waking up one day and not having enough water and feeling like the governor needs to step in and tell us all what we're doing with it. But maybe I'm missing something in that. Because, for example, we have California that you can read in the news, when it rains in LA, 80% of the water goes back to the ocean. They don't capture it. They're going to have another water emergency. I was talking to an attorney in California, and she goes, oh yeah, she says, it's raining like crazy right now. Everything's flooding. 80% of it's going back to the ocean. She says by July, they're going to restrict our watering on lawns again. And to me, that's saying, to me, the solution for that is, well, let's build a dam and capture some of this water, this 80% that's going back to the ocean. Now, Utah, it's a little bit different because we're a captive water system. And I do think we need to be wise about water and water use and things. But I think still, to me, the notion of waking up one day and having an emergency water shortage that day is a little concerning. I could see it with an earthquake. But I'm struggling to see it in other situations where we didn't see it coming long before.
That's my concern, Austin. It's just like, why all of a sudden is Governor Cox the one that determines it's an emergency shortage? Why is he given all this authority? Why isn't it going to more or less the people as opposed to just him?
Yeah, and again, in the bill, this one does have a couple people. So it's Governor Cox. And then let's see.
So I missed it.
It says he has to have the advice and recommendation of the state engineer. And it has to be in consultation with, but that's really squishy language, but in consultation with the Emergency Management Administration Committee. So I think this bill is also creating this committee that, again, it's an Emergency Management Administration Committee. Sounds kind of like FEMA, where the state's saying we're going to have something to manage emergencies. And so he has to at least consult with them. It doesn't say he has to follow their advice. He only has to have the advice and recommendation of the state engineer. So we have the governor, state engineer that has to advise and recommend it too. And then they have to consult with this committee, but they don't have to follow the committee. So it's still, I think your concern is very valid. It's just to say that there are some pieces where they put in a little bit of checks, and you can see those people talked about in lines 329 through 333 of the bill. But it is a real concern to say, again, why is our governor the one? Did we love how things went under COVID? I think some people did, some people didn't. I don't know if there was a person that felt they did it just right. I don't know of anyone that felt they did it just right. They either felt they should have done way more or should have done way less. But it is concerning when, again, one day you're going to work and the next day you're banned from going to work. And if you go out, you're a criminal. I know parents who had police and fire department show up to say they can't play at the public park because the park was closed. And those things happen overnight in these types of situations with this type of power. So again, an important issue for sure to look at of water. What do we do about it? But are we putting appropriate checks and balances on it or not? So thanks for bringing that one up. Let's see. And then someone had a question about HB 131, vaccine passport amendments. Or vaccine passport prohibition, asking what happened in the House. So it looks like it passed the House based on the bill notes, and it's now in the Senate committee. So Senate Rules Committee is going to send it to a Senate committee to be heard. And that's one that's banning businesses from mandating that customers or employees have a vaccine in order to come in there. But it is one that has some exceptions to it. There's still some ability for employers to do that, or for the government even to do that. But for the most part, that's banned for a lot of businesses. And again, this was presented last year. It didn't quite get through. But we do have that. Looks like it's passed the House. So there's a lot of legislation that's at least passing one body of government at the moment. And it will be interesting to see how some of these go, where again, there's some big sea changes. There's certainly, I think, some good bills or some good intentions, but there's a lot of concerning things too. And one of those obviously is, how much should our government solve for us, or how much should we solve for ourselves? And if we ask our government to solve all of our problems, the only way ultimately to do that is for them to take away all our rights. Because so long as people have rights somewhere, there'll be some abuse, some issue, something that happens. And we have to decide how much we're willing to tolerate as a society, and what we're willing to tolerate it with, or if we want the government to be involved in all those things. And I think no matter what side of the fence you fall on, Republican, Democrat, anything else, I don't believe that any of us trust every government actor that's in place. And we see how government actors change hands, or positions change, power changes hands, all these things. And there's quite the little seesaw effect sometimes of, we pass an executive order here, new governor or president comes in and cancels it. And it's this kind of creates an unstable society of back and forth, this election to that election. And so law is supposed to create a foundation for us, but it feels like law is starting to be used as just a power grab almost, where we don't like some things, so we go regulate it. We don't like some things, so we go regulate it. And so my push with people always is to say, hey, we should probably be wise as citizens and try and solve some of these problems on our own.
Amen.
But we have to do that. We have to take those steps and do that.
It almost seems like the legislators are incentivized to come up with these bills. I mean, at the very beginning, when the session started, there were over 300.
Yeah, and again, usually by the end of the session, there's usually over 500 in the House by the time it finishes. And this was something, when you talk about the incentive, so I had a rep in West Valley he was Fred Cox, and Mike Winder eventually ran against him. And one of the things that Fred Cox was criticized for was that he was criticized for not passing bills. And people were upset that he wasn't passing a lot of bills. And I remember thinking, isn't that a good thing? um, shouldn't we be grateful there's someone up there not pushing a lot of new bills? But it is something that people often demand. It's part of the resume that politicians go back on. Well, I did this bill, this bill, this bill. And so, yes, they have an incentive to pass bills and to meddle in things. But we as a people, I think, have to change the basis for what we elect people for. You know, are we electing people to go solve problems, or are we electing people to say, you know what, don't do anything up there unless there's something very serious that's gone out of whack that needs to be addressed. But let's have, you know, a 2-year sabbatical from passing new laws. That'd be interesting. And so, but I think as people, we often demand that of reps. We ask them what their resume is. We want to know what they've done, how influential they are. And that's something that's a monster that we're creating ourselves by what we demand of people. So, but it is something to be wise to. But yeah, but thanks for joining today. Thanks for those that had questions on bills to talk about. We'll meet again tomorrow at 7 if you guys are up for that. And we'll put the recording online as usual so that people can see that. But we appreciate your time and your attention. You know, reach out to your reps if you have concerns. Share your thoughts, feelings with them. Even if it doesn't change the actual outcome of the bill, it, I think, still builds a case for future changes, other things. And we shouldn't despair just because something passes immediately or doesn't pass. A lot of these things still get worked on over time. And if the voices stay active and people keep talking, there can even be pushback that causes things to go the other way. So, so keep up the good work. And we appreciate each of you. And we'll plan on talking more tomorrow or next week.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Austin and Tara. Thank you.
And thank you all.